Thanks for joining us today for this Environmental Division session. We're going to be talking about effective permitting strategies for capital projects. We're very excited for our presenters to talk about a variety of different projects and their experiences. So, my name is Amar Patel, and I'm with Bar Engineering. I'm based out of Salt Lake City. I'd like to introduce the co-chair. And Anil and I will be kind of help facilitating, moderating the session and the Q&A as well. We have a number of great speakers today. So we'd like to get started with the presentations and really adhere to the timelines that we have in the SME guideline book. So those who are interested in coming and going can be represent the or see the presentations they'd like to see. And we'll be generally going about 20 minutes total for each presenter, with 17 minutes with our presentation materials and then 2 to 3 minutes for Q&A. Additionally, if we have time, and there's time between now and the environmental luncheon, we'd like to have a kind of a forum discussion to really engage the audience, to see what you guys are thinking about, you guys and girls are thinking about, and engage with our speakers. And if you don't have an opportunity to attend that, please look to contact one of our presenters and engage a dialogue with them afterwards. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Amar. Appreciate being here. My name is Bruce Macdonald. I'm a senior scientist at SLR International in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we are doing our own introductions. So yes, I have about 40 years of experience doing a wide range of air quality and other permitting, and including things such as environmental audits and anything that's virtually related to air quality. Our firm does a full range of environmental services. I'm speaking here on behalf, I'd like to recognize my co-author Jason Reed, who helped put this together. We are really going to be focusing on what we call the evolution of modeling air requirements for air quality. Evolution may be a polite word for smashing up and starting over again or making changes. But in this case, it really is kind of a change of what's being done in terms of what was done and what will be done. So we're going to look at some timeline of some recent changes all the way back to 2010 that affect the air quality standards and the modeling that's associated with it, mainly focusing on the new tighter standards, particularly for NO₂ and SO₂, the new 1-hour standards, and then delving a little bit into the chemistry that needs to be included now in a modeling application. These are reactions that occur in the atmosphere that are not directly emitted by a source, but have to be addressed as part of the permitting process. Particularly for PM 2.5, which of course has an interest in mining operations because of the secondary formation of particulates from nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. We now have to account for that, at least in the major source permit applications. Many states also can require inclusion of these reactions as part of a minor source application as well, and they do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent guidance that has to do with ambient air boundaries. Many states have been accommodating the mining operations by being a little flexible with ambient air boundary, but in this case, it's now officially part of the EPA policy, and I think will reflect well on any planning operations. The point, I guess, here really of my presentation is to understand these modeling requirements as they apply to new capital permitting operations. Because if you've been involved in air permitting, you know that an air permit needs to be acquired before you can begin construction of the facility, and that often is the critical path for staying on schedule. So with this guidance here, a little bit of support, try to point out what to do to pave that critical path and obtain a permit that's really timely, on time, and meets the standards. Just a quick review here. Back in 2010, there was a set of new 1-hour standards for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. This was a real change, of course, from what was previously done, and I'll explain that a little bit later. In 2012, EPA granted a Sierra Club petition that they needed to include these photochemical issues into a major source permit. And that made quite a change because we had always been using, like for particulate matter, just use primary particulate and not be concerned or brush off the influence of the sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides that are emitted as well. And at that same time, there was another lowering of the annual PM 2.5 standard, which now sometimes can be quite constraining. Usually we worry about the short-term standards, but now the annual PM 2.5 can be constraining on many operations. In 2015, there was another lowering of the ozone standard, and that required a little bit more addressing of impacts. EPA then proposed revisions to Appendix W in regard to changing the guideline to accommodate these different chemical concerns. There were draft revisions and final guidance issued in 2016. I'll explain a little bit what the MERPs is. That might be an important word as you go forward. And finally, 2017, we have the Appendix W promulgated in its current fashion. The pre-2010 standards then involved for SO₂, you can see the line really had a very relatively low concentration at the annual standard, and then there was a 24-hour and a 3-hour standard for SO₂, and there was only a 1-hour standard for NO₂. Well, that changed as part of these new standards, and we ended up with a very much lower, really, I would think, 1-hour standard compared to the others. The 3-hour and 24-hour standards for SO₂ are no longer, and annual, are no longer enforceable at the federal level. So we're really looking at this 3-hour standard only as a secondary issue, and then the 1-hour standards then become the big compliance issue for any new source. This is really, it's the maximum 1-hour concentration of these, daily concentration of these pollutants at the 98th and 99th percentile over a whole year. And with some designs, that can be quite a challenge to meet. The complexity really is shown up here on this slide, and that is that these are important issues now that have to be addressed, ozone and the secondary PM 2.5, we'll look at that. And then the NO₂ is another complex development because, of course, that's not emitted directly from an industrial source. For NO₂, the emissions are actually as NOx, but the standard is NO₂. And so there is an important consideration to take a NOx emission and make an estimate of what's actually being emitted as NO₂. Then beyond that, NO₂ is, oops, back up here. NO₂ is generated in the atmosphere. It's converted from NO into NO₂ in the atmosphere in the presence of ozone, sunlight, and other operations. So then as part of this latest guidance, EPA developed a 3-tiered approach to looking at modeling that impact. The first one is just a simple 100% conversion, presume that it all turns into NO₂. The second tier is a more complicated one where you look at it adjusting the impact based on the ratio that's in the atmosphere. If you gather the relevant data, gather that, and you can say, well, 50% of our 50% of the existing NO₂ in the atmosphere is, 50% of the NOx in the atmosphere is NO₂. So we use that ratio and say, okay, from this facility, it's going to be the same thing. It's relatively straightforward. It's looking at what the ratio is in the atmosphere and using it for your own modeling. Tier 3 is much more complicated. We'd love to have you do Tier 3 because that takes a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort. But there's ways to avoid that, of course, by trying to implement these first 2 tiers. In order to model under 1-hour NO₂, there's a relatively straightforward path. This looks a little complicated, but we start out with a basic design and just try Tier 1 or Tier 2, which are relatively straightforward and can be done without a lot of photochemical and other atmospheric reactions. If it works, you're good. Otherwise, you can make some adjustments to Tier 2, and that doesn't cost a lot, doesn't take much effort in terms of adding these different components, ozone and the ambient ratio method, adjust maybe the site layout if you had a problem, put an engine a little farther away from the boundary, for example, or raise the stack of a generator or some other NOx emitting issue source that you can reduce the impact at the boundary by moving it. And finally, if those don't work, Then we're down here, and these are not working. Then you refit this. Finally, the worst case, of course, is to get into all these adjustments. The further boundary, the site location, stack height, all of these things can be revised in order to demonstrate compliance with the NO₂ standard. But the emphasis would be to focus on the tier one approach, or tier 2, and redesign the project basically to show compliance without having to get into this very complicated photochemical modeling. Then I'll get into atmospheric chemistry here. What we're really doing, again, is addressing the secondary formation in the atmosphere, where nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide form particulate matter, PM2.5. Previously, that had not been much of an issue with PM or even PM10, but PM2.5 is a much tighter standard. And now with the with the consent agreement with the Sierra Club, EPA has to address this for major sources, and of course states are doing that as well. Ozone is another one, which can't be just brushed under the rugs anymore. If you're a VOC and NOx source, you have to look at what the impacts are of ambient ozone from a new proposed source. So the approach here is to address this, again, in a tiered approach. Tier 1 is using existing information to see what happens with emissions of NOx and SO2 to form PM2.5, for example. And you do that by looking at another facility that had gotten a permit in that same area and handled the PM2.5 formation based on its emissions, and sort of develop a ratio of what the impacts are on ambient PM2.5 from what they were from this existing facility. It's relatively straightforward, and I'm going to get into a couple calculations here. I'm not going to get too nerdy for all the modeling specialists. We could really be here, but I think it would be a little boring, and we don't have that much time. If that doesn't work, of course, then you're dropped into a tier 2 approach. And again, that's a huge effort that requires a lot of time and money to conduct that type of study. So modeled emission rates for precursors were what were developed by EPA in response to this requirement. And basically what they aim at is a screening level for single source permit applications. That is, that you can take the emissions from one source and make an estimate of what the impacts are downwind from the SO2 and NO2 emissions. And the point, again, is, as was allowed, it's based on existing empirical relationships. That's a modeling study that was done that's relevant for the area you're proposing, that comes up with an impact calculation for PM2.5. So EPA actually developed a whole array of modeling results across the country, and they looked at a regional basis, east, west, central, and west, largely because, of course, the differences in climate, humidity, sunlight, other different things. Stack heights, again, of course, that makes a difference. If you have a higher stack, the impacts are going to be probably reduced. And even emission rates, running tests from 100 to about 3,000 tons per year of emissions for each one. And the location of these sources are, of course, modeled across the U.S., so any user can jump in and try to use this Tier 1 approach. You can see we do have some good examples here in the West: Nevada, California, much of Colorado, Utah, and areas where there's mining now have relevant modeling exercises for these pollutants based on EPA's study. So under the MERP approach, then, they developed what they called a significant impact level. That is 1.2 micrograms per cubic meter for 24-hour PM2.5, 0.2 for annual, and 1 part per billion for ozone. So a new permit application should try to demonstrate that its impacts are below these thresholds by using one of these methods. In particular, the Tier 1s, the screening levels that will get you below a significance level and thereby not have to do additional modeling, because it's by EPA determination determined to be not significant. So stay below those thresholds. And as I just indicated, that whole modeling result then really is just a relationship between emissions and modeling. And they developed a huge database, as you can see. This is all in their report, where there's a number of emissions and emission rates, stack heights, and other things. And they developed some MERP values. that if you look at them carefully, these are the worst case thresholds that would generate an impact of the threshold value. And I want you to look real closely here at, I think there it goes. Look closely here in the west where we're at 24-hour PM10 of what, 1155 and 24-hour SO2 of 225. And it's a very simple ratio to take those numbers and say that you're not significant. So assume we have a new source of 250 tons a year NOx, 25 tons per year of SO2. Make the calculation from those MERPs values that I just showed you, and then calculate the impact. So we calculate the combined impact, and we take the ratio of our emissions to those numbers in the threshold table, and add up NO₂ and SO₂ and get a number that's less than 1. There's no significant impact. So as part of planning, look at these numbers and try to stay below those thresholds, because that would be a key way of saying that you are not significant for secondary PM 2.5. There's a second cut at ozone as well, in which it's very similar here, except, and I can discuss this maybe offline if someone has some detail, because this gets a little more in the weeds, where we look at a similar approach for one of the sites that was explicitly modeled. And in this case, there's just really a ratio of this site at Churchill, where 500 tons led to 2.29 parts per billion, 500 tons of VOCs led to 0.11, and we use a ratio here that 500 to 2.29 is to X to 1. So multiply this out, and we have a new threshold of 218 tons per year, and then end up and recalculate the sum of the ratios and come up with 0.8. The key here is that this is a second approach. You don't need to have the worst case that were in the table. We can look at individual sources and come up with thresholds that still show insignificance. There's one other thing I wanted to bring, and that has to do with the ambient air boundary, because now that's officially new policy at EPA, and that is to allow different ways of setting the ambient air boundary. For the previous approach, the area had to be owned and controlled by the source, and the second part was that a fence or a barrier had to be in place, and preclude public access. Well, this first one still applies, but now EPA will allow these other approaches, video surveillance, signage, keeping people out, other things. You can kind of define your own ambient air boundary if you need to. And as an example, on the left, the prior guidance, you could only really exclude the fenced plant area from the ambient air compliance. Whereas now, if you own the property around these different facilities, and you could either fence it or put signage on it, then now you can redefine the ambient air boundary. In this case, as an example, where we didn't pass, we were above the NACs next to the plant. That happens a lot. And so now with this new guidance, then you can put a boundary around it that essentially avoids that. So in summary then, I think the key thing here is to understand these new methods of calculating significance, that you can use them in planning. It's better to build them in at the planning project, at the design and operations, than try to get a modeling in after the design is already under construction. Developing modeling protocols is always easy for agency support, get their buy-in with background data and meteorology, and basically go forward ahead of time with the proposed approach. Just to mention here too, future updates are coming related to flag guidance. That's the impact on Class 1 areas. We'll be seeing something coming out in the near future. It's been promised in 2019, and so we'll look for that. And other technical things such as calculation of building downwash. So we'll keep an eye on all of these things and follow up as best we can. I have a copy of the paper. If you want a copy of it, you can stop at our booth. It's number 1037. Be glad to hand that out, or stop by during the day. I'll be glad to discuss any in particular questions. And I have, 2 minutes to pick up some questions if you have some right offhand. Yes?
I was surprised to see that signage is a sufficient control for boundary. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a practical matter, ambient air is something where the public can't have access, where you can basically exclude them. And we've worked with like mines in Wyoming where the state will allow an area to be excluded from ambient air if there's clear ability of the facility to post it and keep people out. So states have had that flexibility, especially for minor sources. And now EPA has officially adopted this guidance. It's only guidance, though. I mean, that could change with a change in administration. You probably are familiar with that. And the guidance now allows you to redefine that boundary. So anything that's occurring right around the plant, you might be able to wiggle a way out of it. Does that answer your question? It's
Yeah,
just
I wonder if
become...
we're getting a little- maybe our state is just more restrictive, so maybe that's where my confusion is coming in.
The state, you mean, is?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they have options. They don't need to go with EPA guidance for minor sources. There's that prerogative. But at least the fact that EPA is not going to overfile on them may make a difference. I know working in Nevada is very accepting of this expanded boundary approach.
Minnesota allows that as well. What do I do? Okay, well, I'm gonna stop and get that paper.
Any more? I have 1 minute. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it again. Sorry, thanks.
Ready?
Yeah. Let's make sure it all works. Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Brad Moore, and I'm the Executive VP for PolyMet, in charge of the environmental and regulatory. And this presentation was also put together by Kearney, who's our lead technical person, and Letitia Gietzen, who's the lead public affairs person for our project. And in this short time, what I want to do is give you some of the lessons that we've learned in our project in terms of what's been key to getting permitting success. We have a proposed copper-nickel project in northern Minnesota, open pit mine, that was subject of a joint federal-state EIS, involved the Forest Service, the Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, and then state regulatory agencies as well. And we have 23 of our 25 permits. And so what I want to go through is some of the key points about what we've learned over the last 8 years in gaining those permits. And I think two key messages for you. One is that the permitting process is incredibly dynamic and it's nonlinear, and that your permitting team, which includes not only your company, but all the consultants, communities, et cetera, have to move and change as that process morphs and changes over time. And the other thing is the importance of peer review and bringing others in to look at your work, both in the context of litigation, but also just to make sure you're on the right path as you move forward. So, you know, we all hear about technically feasible, meeting the law, and it can be designed and built. How many times have you been somewhere and someone says, well, we should get this because we meet the law? And yet we all know in this room that it goes so far beyond the law in terms of what it actually takes to get things done. And that's really what I want to talk about. You know, the way we look at it, a lot of to get a new mine permit in the US is about a third technical, a third emotional and social. And by the way, that emotional, social, even goes down to regulatory relationships. Does your air permit engineer have a good relationship with the regulatory agency's permit air engineer? Example there is we had one personality conflict, and we literally just brought a different person from the same consulting group, changed the relationship in the meetings in order to move forward. And so that's what I mean by dynamic, is paying a lot of attention to the little things, relationships, et cetera. And then, of course, the third, political. You've got changes in the national election, local, state, all the political work. It changes as well over time. Project obviously has to be technically sound, socially acceptable, and you've got to have your political support. So in terms of technically sound, one of the things that's clearly that we ran into early on is the project wasn't frozen. The engineers appropriately are always finding better ways to make the project more efficient, but we'd come in with those regulators and there'd be a slight change. And then the question is, do you need to remodel it? So for the environmental team, anything you can do to freeze that project and keep it static during the process as much as possible really helps. working to accommodate agents' requests. Now, that might sound simple, but if you think about it, my own background is 21 years as a regulator, so I spent a lot of time on the other side. How many times have you seen a regulator held accountable for not doing something? It's pretty darn rare. So you basically have a situation where someone has complete control or power over your project, and so you really have to work on the relationship and to really try to accommodate their needs. Because if you get into loggerheads, you'll be the loser either in not getting what you need or in large delays in time. And then being procedural savvy, the agencies don't know it all. The laws are very complex. An example for our project is just last week, we were working with a state agency that didn't understand some of the procedural laws related to the Local Wetland Conservation Act. And I was literally in there with a senior leader of the Department of Natural Resources explaining a local aspect of the law that related to how we put a monitoring well in. And just a very quiet conversation, the law there, and building that relationship in order to get what we need. Quality work from consultants, it goes without saying. And that's where that peer review comes in, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then constantly through the process is coordinating between the technical and the legal. And I'll give you an example of that right now. So think of multiple jurisdictions, state and federal agencies, differing technical experts, regulator conservatism, and a long process. Oops. So this is my example. This is a map of our proposed mine site. And while you can't see very closely, the little yellow dots are proposed monitoring wells. Early in our environmental impact statement development, or ES development, EPA was unhappy with the amount of monitoring wells we had. They said, you guys don't have enough. And our consultants said, yes, we do have enough. And we shouldn't have to put more wells in. And we were at loggerheads with Region 5. So what happened is we brought in a litigation consultant. And the litigation consultant came in and assessed for us how we would do in terms of litigation with the number of wells we had. And they said, you're technically right, you're statistically right, but we don't think you're going to prevail in court. So we went and then actually got another consultant to help out, Andrea's team right here from Foth, and they brought in an individual who has expertise in mod flow and in litigation, has been litigating these issues actually in the courts, with bans and other opposition, and came in and then developed a proposal for additional wells. So then we went back down to EPA and we negotiated with them where they said, you know what, the new number of wells you've got here, we like it. And then we worked with EPA to decide what would be measured, how often, and when it'd be enough. And in the end, through that process, which among other things took a better part of a year, we ended up with letters from EPA saying, you've had the right number of wells, you've monitored the right constituents, and we like it, and you're good. So think of that now, and this NPDES permit, which we have, is now under litigation, and we have these kinds of letters from EPA saying, you guys are good. So that's an example where original consultant was right, but we needed someone else to do a peer review. We had to have the litigation folks come in, and then we, as much as we hated it, we had to adjust our process, and we had to change our thinking and do more. But as a result, we have an NPDES permit now. Another example, just looking at that map used to be all U.S. Forest Service land. We have that land now because we did a 6,000 acre land exchange. So how do you get that done? Get back to the relationships. We had contacts and relationships with the Forest Service in Washington, D.C., with the Forest Service in the Eastern region, with the Superior National Forest. We had former U.S. Forest Service employees that were consultants working on our team. And we had litigators that literally litigated land exchange issues on our team. So over the process of about 5 years, all those different individuals in those relationships were able to move that Forest Service exchange through. One other thing we had too that was really important is the land that's here, the Forest Service didn't really want, and we found a parcel that they wanted more. So immediately, they were on board with the land exchange. And even though they were on board, the processes are so complex, we needed that large team for everyone to get through the process over a number of years. So one thing you'll see is in these permitings, whether it's a 106 issue, whether it's your biological assessment or biological opinion, we add and build in consultants and experts that are good in that area to develop a high-quality proposal. We work with the litigators and the lawyers to make sure, is this going to go? And then you move through the next process. So over the years, our permitting team fluctuates up and down, and different kinds of individuals who have the very best expertise, in my opinion, where we can find nationwide, actually. So then we move from that technical legal to the social, local support. Corporate responsibility starts on day one, working with the local communities. Note this, providing frequent updates, et cetera. What we've found almost inevitably is that our best meetings are one-on-one. It's not advertising on a billboard. It's not the ads on TV. It's presentations. It's going out in the local community. It's tours of our site. It's interactions are one-on-one, 10-on-1. So we are an open book in terms of constantly going out and talking to people and delivering our message. We've done hundreds and hundreds of meetings. And of course, transparency is a must. The other side doesn't have to be, but we do. And then our company and individual employees are engaged. This is, on the left slide, is a community picnic that we do every year for the town of Hoyt Lakes, which is right next to our proposed mine site. Testing of the reverse osmosis, which for northern Minnesota hasn't been used in the mines. Scholarships for STEM kids. We have a program every year where we do college scholarships, really popular, and basically telling the community that we support their youth. Testing passive treatment systems, road cleanups, and then the bees on the lower right, part of our tailings basin is reclaimed. And so we've got beekeepers out there. And one of the interesting things about the bees is we learned that the mix of grasses in Forbes was too tiered towards the spring and not flowering for the entire summer. So we're going to change some of our pollinator mix that benefits pollinators throughout the growing season. Just little things that, demonstrate to people. When Letitia's out with legislators, we have the honey, and the little from the basin. It's really good. And just those tiny little areas of touching to show that we're people as well, and we're out there and we care. Support groups. So we obviously have our Mining Minnesota, which is, like National Mining Association or the others. And then we've got one called Better in Your Backyard, and they tend to be from the younger folks, the millennials and others, that's locally out there advocating for us. And then another one called Jobs for Minnesotans. These groups have been critical in our permitting and our political work because they represent voices that are not the company. And they're voices of local people that put the letters to the editor and are out there speaking. So think of it as a trusted individual, but it's not the mining company. And to give you an example of what that success can look like, at Jobs for Minnesotans, we had multiple public meetings on our environmental impact statement. And the one that was going to be really contentious was in the Twin Cities metropolitan region. And of course, you have a lot of our opposition in the urban area. These guys went out to labor and got a whole bunch of people coming to that meeting. So it ended up the 2,000 people at the meeting, it was about 50-50. It was balanced. And just the press and the TV station, the video showed it was balanced. And that was a win. It was just a win that it wasn't a room full of people like against it. They're like, it was mixed. And it gets back to that neutrality, just keeping people from going from, neutral to negative. The other thing is that's been on all these groups is strong support from labor. We have a project labor agreement, and labor has been really, really key in, particularly with politicians. In our state, some of the Democrats are kind of split. The rural Democrats like mining, the urban ones are less supportive, but the common denominator is labor, they want it. And so they really help keep a lot of those politicians kind of in the middle road there, is what I'd say. And again, it's meeting constantly with labor, going to their annual meetings and giving them updates and that one-on-one kind of conversations. So when you look at the political, you've got to have your support of local politicians, clearly. And there's a constant education of candidates and elected officials. Oftentimes when we bring people from the urban part of Minnesota, which is growing in terms of its influence, they've never seen a tailings basin. They've never seen a concentrator building. The one we're going to refurbish is 1/3 of a mile long. And just visually for them to come up see it, talk to us, look at the ground, et cetera. It really is an eye-opener for them. And then with each changing election, we are out there with the delegation, our congressional delegation, those that support us and those that don't. So we always come into offices and constantly. And then, of course, articulating the benefits of the project, et cetera. The other thing is these next two slides are just examples of what I use with the public. Because where the public's worried about mining, you're trying to figure out how do you get them so they're like, well, I don't want to hear. This is where example, this is in DRC, where you've got child labor. This is a very complex issue because if you throw these folks off the land, what are they going to do? And we know that it's not simple. But I remind people that are using their cell phones, their electric cars, et cetera, that we are going to mine somewhere, and the laws that we have in the United States are among the best. This is another one we use, looking at air emissions in the United States versus other countries. And we say, look at this, folks. We got great laws. We can do it well here. And then we point out where some of our other metals come from and say, this is an example. And usually it's about keeping people neutral instead of moving them into that opposition area. So basically the formula in it, that's a lot too linear than it really is. But a technically feasible project, and that means when it's feasible, it means there's been peer reviews, and the lawyers have looked at it as well. Example of that, dam safety, in the news a lot. Bar Engineering is our main consultant on dam design, done a great job. We brought in peer reviews on that design to look at it again. Department of Natural Resources, looking at the Montana law, brought an independent review panel looking at that as well, and their consultants. I think our dam safety's had 4 or 5 independent reviews. So think how that will fare in litigation. Social acceptance, local community support, keeping the neutral people neutral, political support, making sure people understand the benefits of the project, and then leads to that permitting success. And this is where we're at right now. And it's always with permitting, there's always a job to do. That bottom right corner, we're looking at a ROD from the Corps and the 404 permit really in the coming weeks. That's what we have left. And so you've got federal EIS, state, permits, et cetera. Anyway, I've gone through a lot, and I'm here for questions. Yes, sir.
Quick question for you. What strategies have you employed to address the misinformation that constantly comes from the NGOs?
First of all, it's just an amazing problem in terms of how constant it's coming. It's like every single day. Those interest groups like Better in Your Backyard and Jobs for Minnesotans constantly push out that information, and our labor groups. We will be in the papers and a little bit, but it's so much stronger. And what's happened in Minnesota, and Letitia, Christy, jump in, is they've been drumming the message so much, but the regulatory process has moved on, the permits have been issued, it's been tamped down. In other words, people said, we have heard this from you for 5 years, and it's not new. But it's a constant work with those interest groups, ours, pushing back into that system. Yes, sir.
Regarding permitting for a company who has 0 track record, and let's say that company wants to do cyanide heap leach, and the location is between 3 rivers, 2 reservoirs, and an underground tunnel. And the mine is right in the middle. And this mine, so-called newly established company, has no track record. Under those conditions, what would you do?
It's a great question. The first thing I would do is look for other examples of that kind of mining where there are successful mines that are operating with high environmental standards. So first of all, look at your peer group in terms of who's doing it well. And then given that, take a look at the people that helped get them there, the consultants, the lawyers, and others in terms of how did they end up having a really well operating mine in that situation. I would start there. Obviously, you also have to do a really good risk assessment as to whether you can actually permit the mine in that place. In other words, I'd be really hard on the problem and give it a hard look to say politically and socially, even if it's technically feasible, do some really hard upfront work to make sure you think, can we actually do this?
So the rules and regulations will be much stricter for
Yes.
How bad?
Pardon?
How much bad? How strict?
I think you'll be put to, every permit you have will be tighter than whatever the law is. I mean, it'll be across the board. You'll be held to a standard much, much higher.
So what if there's political pressure to have that company go there?
You still have to assess the litigation side of it. I can talk more offline with you on it. Any other questions, sir?
David Pere with AEB. If you think the overall capital cost of a mine or reactivate a mine like that, what's the percentage of the cost for getting permitted?
Sure. So the estimated cost to build our mine is close to $1 billion. The investment so far is about $360 million. Of that, the permitting, the environmental, is $120 million. Yep. So that would be 10%. Yes, one more.
Lessons learned working with Native tribes?
You know, a couple things there is that we've got 3 different bands that are in the project area. One is very, very close to the project area. Great working relationships with them, and we have helped sponsor scholarships, work with the community closely. We have another band that typically opposes most mines in the region and has fought them, and they're fighting us, but we keep an open door of communication, treat with respect, and continue to work with them. One thing I didn't add in my presentation in the 3 seconds I have left is that for the opposition or those that oppose us, you'll never see us out there criticizing them. You won't see us attacking them. Not once. You have a respectful relationship, and that's how you carry yourself. The others can go after you, but you maintain your composure through the process. Thanks, everyone.
And additionally, I did notice some people taking photos of the presentation. That is prohibited by SME, so please respect the presenters and engage with them to get their materials or slides rather than taking photos. A couple other comments I'd like to make really quickly. We are running a little fast, and we want to stick to the schedule that's in the SME book. For those who just entered and did not catch the original opening remarks, we are going to have a forum kind of afterwards with our panel speakers. So if you have questions that you'd like to hold for that, we're going to be going after our last scheduled speaker until the environmental luncheon. And lastly, we're kind of crushed on space, so if you have an opportunity to move in and you're going to be sticking around for a while, that'd be greatly appreciated. So those who are interested can join as well.
Thank you so much, Amar. Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Martin. I am thrilled to be after Brad because our presentations have some thematic similarities, so this couldn't have been better planned. Thank you. All right. I have worked in the mine permitting arena for about 15 years, and my co-author, Steve Donohue, has had extensive experience in the Great Lakes with mining projects and with litigation. I've given testimony on 2 contested cases in Michigan, and Steve's had more than several that span various states up there, Wisconsin and Michigan, and then as well, mostly focusing on permitting litigation, but then also for reclamation, for mine owners seeking reclamation, the hearings that take place when agencies make decision to reduce financial obligations. So there's a lot of aspects of litigation on our project. So, are there any lawyers in the room? Oh, darn it. I'll apologize up front for my bad lawyer jokes, but we will have some laughs at your expense, so I'll follow up with you afterwards, please. So litigation is a very intense time in a project. Front-end litigation in particular, as Brad just described with PolyMet, a lot of money has been invested in the project and they haven't been making any money yet. So by the time litigation occurs on a permitting process, the mine owner is eager to get started. So that means that the finances, the investors, and the whole technical team is ready, and they still have a mountain to climb with litigation. The risks and schedule delays in litigations are also quite uncertain and add to the stress of it. So the cash flow, as you can see, some of these aspects to the litigation process just really draw on funds at that time. So acknowledging that anyone can sue anybody, the types of litigation scenarios that we've seen are something along the lines of this. An agency who maybe issued a permit or rendered a decision, is sued by opponents to the project. The project proponent, the mine owner, the operator, supports the agency's case to defend their decision. And then the mine owner has its litigation team that supports the whole process. So our experience as consultants, then we're in that litigation team box. You can see it's legal experts, technical experts. When the permit applications are prepared, there's a lot of documentation and analysis, baseline studies that go into it, and those become the material of what is talked about in the contested case or the litigation. So the presentation, I just want to touch base on these topics here. We'll talk a little bit about the opponents, some of the common issues that we see targeted in the litigation in this neck of the woods, what one can do when preparing work. Obviously, work prepares long before litigation occurs. What one might do for preparation for testimony if you're called upon to be a witness or to provide some deposition. What happens during direct and cross-examination, and then we'll wrap up. So first, the opponents. No surprise here, opponents are typically non-governmental groups. Lots of environmental groups. They vary, of course, from local grassroots and into the national organizations. So litigation is very expensive for them as well. So the national organizations sometimes they can network in and provide resources and sophisticated technical and legal help as well. The tribal nations generally fall on the opponents on the litigation case. Brad mentioned the relationship building that takes place during permitting, and this is so key to have those relationships in place and to understand those cultures. I think the social responsibility themes that we've seen in the SME are also part and parcel, but those are assets in this moment when one has to defend a mining project for proceeding. Miscellaneous individuals will pop up as well, maybe local landowners, and surprise, they network. They've become very sophisticated in their approach, and they've got Facebook too. So it becomes a substantial opponent. So the issues, of course, are anything water-related. In this neck of the woods, we have, or up in upper Great Lakes, there's an abundance of water. I know in the West, where there's a scarcity of water, there's those separate issues also become quite prominent in the litigation. Reclamation methods are always a point of discussion, certainly the mine waste structure and then whatever excavation needs to be reclaimed. Contingency planning is a big deal. In fact, contingency planning becomes one of those parts of a mining project strategy that has a tendency to incentivize over-engineering certain things. So for example, water treatment plants or water basin capacities. You tend to want to have contingency so they become a little over-engineered at times. So that's something obviously that impacts costs. Regulatory jurisdictions, you know, whose agency is, got jurisdiction and who should have authority. Moving on, the analysis for potential environmental impacts. You know, obviously that's covered in the EIS. And many points of those environmental impacts are supported by some rather sophisticated models, maybe groundwater model, water quality, and geochemistry model. So whomever is doing the model, you know, there's another modeler who can also do it, and they may come up with different results. So that's always a complex kind of a point of discussion. Tailings facility design. Unfortunately, we've had a recent unfortunate event in the news. It doesn't even matter if it's recent, because those types of events have long lives in these discussions. And then lastly, on this list, this is not comprehensive, but the cumulative impact analysis is kind of an interesting subject. The NEPA has cumulative impact analysis, kind of the foundation of what is thought to be, and the guidance is quite skeletal, and it's an abstract idea, and because someone doing a cumulative impact analysis is doing their best without a lot of guidance, you know, opponents can come in and say, I don't agree with you, and I think you did it wrong. So, especially because cumulative impact analysis is such a banquet. I mean, one can do a number of different approaches to cumulative impact analysis. It becomes a focal point because of its broad you know, way of doing things, and everybody seems to do it differently. So getting to what one can do to prepare a work basis, a body of work documents that go into a litigated project. Of course, by the time you when you start, you don't know whether it's going to be litigated, but planning for litigation is the best way to approach this. So failure to plan is planning to fail. Identify the target issues that you think are going to come up in your region and in your project. Make sure that the work product that goes into your baseline monitoring, your analyses, your permit applications are high quality, concise, well-referenced, and you know, just documented with substantial references. There's nothing worse than going back to an old, you know, report and the references are, you know, have errors in them, and nobody knows how that was done. A highlight on contingency planning, as I said, that, you know, people get worried about overflowing water, you know, what happens in the kind of climate and weather issues that we've all been experiencing lately. And don't forget, emails and texts are discoverable. We've been fortunate that the cases that we've been on have not had discovery, but you never know because it's up to the judge at the time. Do not engage in technical discussions and debates in email because that does become part of the record potentially. Don't put anything in there that you would not share with your mother. So, if you are called for testimony, and you know, the mining industry is highly contentious. Us as professionals, I'm assuming that most of us are scientists and engineers in this room, over the span of a several decade career, you may be called upon to be a witness or to provide deposition. The work that you do, it is hopefully connected to your credentials. So that means obviously your underlying college degree, your advanced degrees. Do you have certifications in the states? Do you have a PE license if that's appropriate? All very, very important. Your testimony typically will focus on either the work that you prepared, or it could be just based on your general expertise, which is actually a little harder because you don't know what the questions might be. Review your homework, because I know I have a problem when I get into a technical analysis and a couple of weeks go by, I can't really remember what the details were. So even though you wrote it, it does stand to be reviewed. Occasionally, witnesses that would be slated to provide testimony may not be available, and sometimes stand-in witnesses are needed. Now, that's a tough situation, but it happens very commonly. So there are ways to stand in for someone, maybe that's review work, or have a third-party review for technical experts to support that analysis if that's what's, under discussion. So moving on, if one is a witness, there's a direct testimony and a cross-examination that takes place in the hearing room. It's not like on TV. The lawyers navigate the testimony, and from what I've heard is they are the ones who make the case. It is not something profoundly spectacular that your witness is going to say. So the direct testimony is when your team's lawyer establishes your credentials, establish your area of expertise regarding the case, and you walk through the narrative that is your work. The challenge is when the cross-examination comes, the other team's lawyer gets to come and try to undermine your work, try to undermine you, and it can be very stressful. They'll go after your credibility and, just even your mannerisms on the stand. So some of the do's and don'ts there, keep your wits and emotions about you. It's very stressful. There's a long lead time for preparation. You kind of have a thought of how it's going to go when you actually get there. It's a sweaty situation. Do your homework, practice and listen to the lawyers, and ask for clarification. So if you're on the stand and there's a question put forward to you, it is up to the lawyers to give you complete clarity. So here's where my bad lawyer jokes come in. If the lawyer asks you where you're alone or by yourself, what would you answer? Could you please rephrase the question? Is your appearance this morning pursuant to a deposition notice which I sent to your attorney? No, this is how I usually dress when I go to work. So whatever you can do to answer honestly and concisely, again, as many times as you need to, ask for clarification. Don't speculate. Actually, the lawyers are looking for an opportunity for you to kind of vary from your narrative. So if they ask you a question that is not directly related to the work that you do or your expertise, do not give an opinion. I think that's probably one of the most valuable strategies for opposition lawyers. Do remember, when you've prepared your own work product, you are the expert. When somebody else reviews your work, they don't know it nearly as well as you, and so I think the confidence, just remembering that, you should move forward in that vein and remember with confidence that that's your work product. Here's another bad one. Have you lived in this town all your life? Not yet. Oh, I guess that was an extra one. Nobody said it. Oh, here we go. What's the date of your birth, sir? July 17th? What year? Every year. So again, keep your wits and your emotions about you in check. That's sometimes hard because we're a fish out of the pond. To wrap up here, providing testimony is a great service to your profession and to the mining industry, so it's a really important role that we play. Providing expert testimony is important to our profession and industry, and gaining the confidence of the communities around us. So in the event that the need arises for any of you to provide testimony, I'm hoping that this presentation has given you a glimpse of what might await you in that arena. So thank you so very much. Any questions? Great. Do we have any questions, or? Yep. Excellent.
Do we have any questions right now?
I don't know.
I have one.
Yes, sir.
Does it help to make a comparison to a project or a source that's already in place that people might know about? And say you'll be better than this, or these are what's different from a source that people know about?
I do. I'm thinking that's more in, the question was, would it be helpful to compare a project to kind of make the case? I think with testimony and deposition, it's so narrow, and what you're speaking of is more of the community relations and public relations. But to support that and to understand that, again, it's back to the team approach. For a witness to understand what's going on outside of their own little arena, would be good. So, very good. Yes, sir?
How often do your lawyers on either side have technical training in these areas?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'll try to amend myself here with the lawyer in the room. There are some really sharp lawyers, and I think environmental law attracts some very sharp people. I'm amazed at some of the technical astuteness of what I've seen. I've also seen on the other side, too, and in fact, being questioned by a lawyer who is not technically astute can be very difficult. There you are in a stressful situation, and you're like, oh, I just got to correct that. So it can be very challenging, and again, it's a real challenge to read people and read how it's going, so. Yes, ma'am?
Is your advice to correct it if they say something?
No, absolutely not. Just answer the question. Yes, no, they ask for clarification. So, and a lot of times if you have a good team there, they'll coach us, because this is not what we normally do. So, very good. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jamie Zsiros, and I work for Ecosystem Investment Partners. Just a little bit about our company. We're a national mitigation banking company that focuses on stream, wetland, and species restoration across the U.S. At the end of the presentation, we'll pull up a map that shows you our national footprint and exactly where we're located. So to get started, I'm going to talk a little bit, give you a little bit of a regulatory background, talk a little bit about what mitigation banks are, the advantages of mitigation banks, and then also give you some examples of how we've helped the mining industry in the past. So I'm sure many of you in the room know about the Section 404 and Section 401 permitting programs under the Clean Water Act, also known as the Waters of the United States, which obviously there's a lot of drama going on right now with the waters of the United States. But Section 404 essentially just establishes a program to regulate dredged and fill material into aquatic features and resources, and that's usually, you're getting a permit through the Army Corps of Engineers, and then the U.S. EPA is typically doing the compliance on your projects. And then Section 401 water quality certification gives the state and tribes a say in the review process. And it really just depends on state to state as to whether or not the 401 state water quality certifications are going to be stricter than the federal regulations or not. If you trip those regulations or criteria, then you need a water quality certification through the state as well. So under both of these programs, the most important thing is all developers need to avoid and minimize their impacts to the greatest extent possible. Once those impacts are avoided and minimized, then what's left over you can mitigate. And typically mitigation is just done by creation, restoration, enhancement, or preservation of features. So with that being said, there are 4 available mitigation options available to developers. They include purchasing credits through a mitigation bank, purchasing credits through an in-lieu fee program, or simply just doing the mitigation yourself, whether it be on-site or off-site. Mitigation banking is essentially, it's just you're purchasing credits through a third-party developer, such as Ecosystem Investment Partners, and we're performing all the restoration, taking on all the liability, the cost risk that would go into the project. And then if you're purchasing credits through an in-lieu fee program, those are typically run by non-governmental organizations or state agencies, and essentially you're paying into a fund where the restoration will be done after the fact, maybe, let's say, 3 years later. And then if you're doing it yourself, then you, as the developer, are responsible for all aspects of your mitigation. Hiring the consultants to do maybe the initial analysis, if you don't do it in-house already. putting up all the financial assurances, recording all the conservation easements, mitigation, monitoring it through the life of the program, and making sure that it's successful in perpetuity. So with that being said, in 2008, there was a mitigation rule that came out through the Army Corps and the federal government, essentially putting a preference, kind of a hierarchy on mitigation. And what they want you to do first is, if there's a mitigation bank within your service area or where your project impact is, they want you to buy credits from a mitigation bank. Second choice is an in lieu fee program, and then the third choice is to do it yourself. So with all that being said, so maybe you're thinking mitigation banking sounds kind of like a neat idea. What is a mitigation bank? So I would say there's 4 main components to a mitigation bank, and that includes our bank site, the interagency review team, the geographic service area, and the bank instrument. So mitigation banks go through the same rigorous permitting process as everybody else. I mean, typically it's maybe a 2-year process, if not longer, to establish a mitigation bank. So typically, as we go into each state, we'll develop an umbrella banking instrument that kind of sets the criteria for that state. So what our performance standards are going to look like, maybe what our credit release schedules are going to look like. Also establishes our service areas, where we're going to be located in the scheme of things, which hydrologic unit code will be located. And then through the whole entire process, who reviews our permits and kind of issues the credit releases are the interagency review team, and that's composed of Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, any state and local entities as well that want to say in the process. So it's again it's a pretty rigorous process that we go through. And I guess I would say with the mitigation bank, the most integral part of a mitigation bank is the bank credit. That's what we're generating, that's what you're buying. And really, a bank credit is just defined as an ecological unit of uplift. So some of the advantages, there's 5 distinct advantages of mitigation bank credits. So first, it minimizes the cost and provides budget certainty. It releases you, the purchaser, from long-term liability. It can accelerate your time to permit. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the preferred compensatory mitigation method by the Army Corps and the EPA, and then it can also reduce your overall credit need and lower the mitigation cost. So I'm going to focus on the first 3 points because I think that's really some of the most important to the purchasers of credits. So how exactly is it going to minimize your cost over doing the project or the mitigation yourself? So it provides a lower overall cost magnitude. So we're able to provide a lower cost per credit because our costs are, due to the economy of scale, where our costs are spread over credits over a fixed period of time, so we can lower the credit cost. And then also we can, for your project, in comparison to, say, doing it yourself or an in lieu fee program, less mitigation may be required because of the temporal loss factor. So the temporal loss factor is simply the time you have the impact to the time that area meets that ecological function. So because our banks are in the ground ahead of your impact, we're not assessed a temporal loss factor. But if you're doing permittee responsible, you are, and if you're buying into in lieu fee programs, you are. So depending on states, that could really result in you having to buy 12 to 20% more credits. So more credits equals greater cost for you. Banking credits also provide better budget certainty. You're going to know the cost of the credit up front. These costs are negotiated with the banker up front, so you have a really good way to estimate your total credit need. And then lastly, we can match the timing of the cost to the timing of the mitigation need. You incur the cost at the time of delivery, not at the outset of your mitigation planning. And again, we assume all upfront costs. There's essentially you as the purchaser are paying for a fully delivered credit. You have no liability, no risk, nothing really. It's just almost like a one and done. You buy the credit and your permit requirements are fulfilled. And then secondly, it transfers long-term liability. I kind of touched on this a little bit, but again, we assume the mitigation bank assumes all risk of mitigation performance. So a lot of times people ask the question, well, what if I buy a credit from the mitigation bank and perhaps the mitigation bank isn't successful? That's completely it's not an issue that you need to deal with. That's completely on the banker. If something would happen to our site, that it wasn't successful, it's up to us to, put up the money to fix it and make sure it's successful in perpetuity. So purchasing a credit's never going to come back on you. And again, you have no risk, again, no cost, risk, or liability, and you have no responsibility for posting any financial assurances and making sure the project is successful in perpetuity. And then lastly, probably most importantly, it can reduce your time to permit. When you're buying bank credits, really the only thing that you're doing is agreeing upon a number and an analysis with the Corps and the EPA and the state. So once you have that number finalized, it's a pretty easy review process for the regulators because they've already reviewed our bank and it's already approved to be used on your project. So this can significantly reduce regulatory review time. And we took a look at some of the national permit data from the 404 program throughout 2010 through 2015 across all different types of mitigation. And essentially what we saw is like buying credits from mitigation banks and in lieu fees can cut your permit time in half. Now, obviously, I can't promise that it's going to cut it in half, but you have a good potential that it will. I mean, there's a lot of other factors that go into your permitting process. They could hold up your project. So let's talk a little bit more about how mitigation banking aids the mining industry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about permittee responsible mitigation versus bank credits. And I know there's a lot of consultants in the room, and this is your bread and butter. And I'm not here to say at all that permittee responsible mitigation does not work. It does. I mean, there's a lot of good companies out there that can do a really great job, and we work with some of them in the room today. So, but what we're finding in the mining industry is there's we're getting a lot of phone calls for miners that have said, okay, well, we've done this mitigation ourselves. Now we're in the 5th to 10th year of monitoring, and the agencies are saying that it failed. So at that point in time, now you have to buy more, or you have to do more mitigation than you would have initially needed to do in the beginning. So if you just would have bought the bank credits from the get-go, you would have been fine. Now you're spending double, triple, quadruple the amount of money to make your unsuccessful PRM successful again by buying bank credits or in lieu fee credits. The bank credits gives you a little bit more flexibility with your project. I mean, there's a lot that you have to worry about implementing a project, and mitigation, really shouldn't be one of them. You're going to let us worry about that for you. And again, as I mentioned, the temporal loss factor. I mean, if you're buying 12 to 20% more credits, that's greater cost. It maybe can blow your budget out. Maybe you could use that money somewhere else in your project. And then again, I just already mentioned the PRM failure would also equal some greater cost as well. So I wanted to give you guys an example of exactly how we as bankers have helped the mining community in the past. And this was something that I actually worked on. We were working with a mining company that had an old legacy project where most of the impacts had been done, but now they needed to fulfill their mitigation requirements. And essentially what happened is initially when the project was assessed, it was assessed using an very old, outdated stream methodology, and now there was a new stream methodology in place. And these two methodologies were like comparing apples to oranges, completely different. So if you had to take that old methodology and use it, kind of compare it to the new methodology, it would have cost this company millions and millions and millions of dollars. So we were able to, work with the regulatory agencies to come up with a reasonable conversion to make it make sense, to more put it on the line of comparing apples to apples. And it was a cost-effective, solution for the mining company, and it was successful, and it's something that they can use on all those legacy projects moving forward. And then thirdly, how we can help the mining industry is the project flexibility. I'll speak for EIP, not any other banking companies out there, but we have the ability to generate long-term forward contracts that have a lot of payment flexibility. Not necessarily do you have to pay for all those credits up front. We can match, if you have phased impacts and the Corps approves, obviously regulatory agencies need to approve, we can match those costs to the phasing of your impacts. So it provides you a little bit more flexibility than having to do it all yourself. And then lastly, probably the most confusing part of the mitigation banking process is the contracts. So there's two different ways you can go about it. Credit reservations, a lot of times people don't need the credits for several months, so we can do a deposit structure that will hold these credits for you for a selected period of time. And then some states require reservation letters specifically, and then some states, we can work with the regulators to just say, hey, these guys are working with us, and we have the credits available, and we'll be drafting up purchase agreements, and we'll have them at the time of the project. So we have a couple different types of purchase agreements that we work through. A standard purchase agreement is typically what's done when you're buying all the credits up front. It's just a very, very basic agreement. And then we can also do option purchase agreements and phase purchase agreements where you have, we negotiate a term where you have the option let's say each quarter to buy the credits. If you don't exercise your option, then obviously you lose the ability to have the credits. We won't keep the reservation for you. But then again, we can do a phase purchase too, where you're paying as the impacts are happening. And then one thing I just wanted to go over, some of the tools that are available to you. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Ribbits, but it's a really good general tool to use to find what mitigation banks are available within your project area. So you can use a find credits tool, which is probably the easiest. You just type in a Latin long, and it'll pull up all the primary and secondary banks within your project area. One thing I will say about Ribbits is it's not always accurate and reflective of the banker's internal ledgers. Ribbits only takes into account the credits that have been deducted through a permit. A lot of times we're working with developers or purchasers and have credits reserved on the back. So I would say the most important tool to you is the mitigation banking company. So just feel free to reach out. I mean, me personally, I'm here to help. I mean, I can walk you through Ribbits and navigate you through the entire process. So, yeah. So with that being said, that's it. And then here's a map of our national footprint. I mean, we're continuing to grow, but this is where we have existing banks right now.
I'm Bruce Allen from U.S. Gietzen. How do you, if you do the banking of it, how do you estimate if it's unsuccessful to have money set aside for that, so that me as a customer would be penalized?
So for our banks not being successful, we have to put up financial assurances that are there in case the bank isn't successful. So that's part of our permitting process where we have to have the money on the backside to make sure that we have the money in the future to take care of any issues. Yes.
What kind of projects you refuse to invest in?
What kind of projects?
Well,
Well,
you don't want to deal with.
that's a good question. So our company focuses on large-scale banking. So I would say smaller sites typically aren't something that we typically invest in. We take a watershed approach, taking in all the wetlands and the streams. So larger sites are typically what we invest in. Maybe smaller sites are something that we wouldn't. But I mean, we pretty much do everything on the natural resources side. I mean, from wetlands to streams to species mitigation, we invest in it all. Yes.
Are your banks on public, private property? Where are these actually living, and who is the land owner, tenant during the banking process?
Sure. No, the banks are not on public property. We purchase the tracts of land ourselves and put the investment in and do the restoration. So, sometimes maybe it's good to get some land next to a preserve area because it provides a contiguous green corridor. But essentially what we do is as we go in and we restore the areas, we are looking for that long-term steward that needs to take it over in perpetuity. And a lot of times some of the state agencies will want to take it over. I mean, I can give you one example. In West Virginia, we have some banks in southern West Virginia, and the DNR had just bought the land to help with their elk restoration efforts. So a lot of times we have to find somebody to take it over, which at that point in time may turn into public lands. But typically you don't want to put the bank on a public land because the regulators will frown upon having restoration on something that's already perhaps conserved. Well, the cost, I can talk to you about cost offline, but the costs are variable. It really just depends on the states, the demand, the location. So costs can change significantly. I can tell you there's definitely a significant cost between wetlands and streams just nationally. But yeah, it's, the size that we're looking for in some of our properties could be like 500 acres. There's certain requirements that are met, so that it's pretty large restoration what we're doing.
Have you received any pushback from any state regulatory agencies regarding your watershed approach? Because, I can see that restoring something that's 500 acres might have disadvantages relative to restoring several places that are like 50 acres.
Right. No, I mean, typically not a ton of pushback. Not all the time are we taking the whole 500 acres in as preservation. Maybe we're doing the buffers around it, but buying that tract of land for 500 acres to get all the features that we need to do the restoration. So we're able to right size the project. We do go through a lot of back and forth with the regulatory agencies, but no, they typically seem to be on board with the watershed approach. And actually they're looking for the watershed approach.
Just a comment. We had our own project, wetland banks proposed that were company-owned. And so we were starting to go through that regulatory process. And you get an example where you're before the county board and they're gonna remove a berm and a local landowner's unhappy with the berm. And then the DNR's got you doing the monitoring to make sure you have hydric soils. And you could see the regulatory nightmare headed towards us. Anyway, we ended up working with EIP with their wetland bank up, you'll see up in Minnesota there. And just looking at the cost for our consultant team, the cost for us, the temporal aspects of wetlands, et cetera, it's a calculation each company has to do on its own, but just the amount of regulatory that we've saved is it's huge.
Yeah.
Because as environmental laws are getting more strict in air, water, wetland, everywhere, it's back to that expertise topic that we've all talked about. These guys, or people like them, they have more expertise than you'll ever have as a mining company. So it's just something to put in the calculation as you're going through permitting, and we've been really happy with your work, by the way.
Well, great, thank you.
How easy is it to set up new banks in areas that don't have an existing banking mechanism?
Well, it can be a little bit challenging. I mean, there's one state in particular that they're trying to work on more of a standardized banking mechanism, and it's difficult. It's tough. I mean, you can get through it, but you're going to have to probably put a little bit more money up front to go through, all the back and forth of the regulatory processes. But I would say, when you're going into a state that doesn't have some sort of established crediting system, it's really, really difficult, because then the developer doesn't have an assessment to utilize. You don't have a crediting system to say, okay, well, this just generated, you need 12 credits, let's say, and we can provide these 12 credits. So it makes it very tough. On
your map there, the three large groups that you had, it was like Texas, Florida, and up in the Great Lakes. What areas, what took place in there? Because I don't see any of the West.
Well, okay, yeah, so the chunks of our banks, so Texas, Louisiana, and Florida are where we have a lot of the banks. A lot of the Louisiana banks are, say, one bank's Pine Savannah credits, the other's Tidal Marsh credits, and then there's a variety of more wetlands down south, obviously, than streams, because there's obviously more wetlands than streams. But in the Appalachia region, Kentucky, we're in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. Our bank primarily focuses on stream restoration in those localities. We do have some wetland credits available, but the primary emphasis is stream restoration. And then again, we're up in Minnesota, we're in Montana, and then we have some performance-based projects out west where we're doing a tidal marsh restoration in California to enhance an endangered or rare species, the Delta smelt. But we're growing. I mean, we were established in 2006, so we continue to add new banks each several years. So there'll be another slew of banks coming here probably soon in location.
Do you partner with the Nature Conservancy or entities like that do look at long-term ownership and stewardship?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, we're working in conjunction, not so much with the Nature Conservancy. the conservation fund, they'll purchase a lot of land. Sometimes they'll take some of the land over. It really just depends. But yeah, I mean, we're always looking for that long-term entity that wants to kind of maintain the land and use it for, you know, natural resources and public services. Is that it? All right, well, thank you very much.